Last weekend, a friend was telling me about how she was randomly pushed into the street by a man as she walked to work in the Auckland CBD. He karate kicked her, then ran off. Last week, my colleague Gwen went for a lunch break in the city and had to duck a punch from an angry, abusive woman.
A woman sort of walked toward me, ranting. I realised she was coming right at me and she started swinging, and I jumped into the street to get away from her, and luckily she kept going.
You were quite shaken when you came back in. Did it throw you?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I think we're quite used to listening to people kind of rant and seeing people who are not kind of in a good space, either, mental health stuff or drug stuff around this area. But to actually have somebody really nearly punch me in the face was pretty startling.
We hear stories like this all the time. The RNZ office in Auckland gets a window seat to the lives of people living on the streets, numbers that have nearly doubled in the last 2 years. One of the consequences, the addicted, the mentally ill, those with nowhere to go, clashing with workers, shoppers, tourists.
One of the areas that consistently comes up is particularly people who work and live in the CBDs and our main streets. The antisocial behaviour really sort of picked up during the COVID period and hasn't yet been resolved.
And now
the government is giving police the power to issue move-on orders to the homeless anywhere in the country.
It's not a huge group of people, but there's a group of people out there that choose to come in and cause trouble on the streets, choose to actually create issues for other people in our CBDs, ignore the fact that they're putting themselves at risk as well, and ignore the police and everyone else that tries to engage with them.
And that's why we're going to be introducing legislation into the House soon to give the police an extra tool to deal with antisocial and disorderly behaviour, and that is move-on orders.
We're just giving police another tool to address antisocial behaviour that has been making people feel unsafe. When people are intimidating others, they're blocking doorways, or they're engaging in threatening behaviour, we want to make sure that police have got the tools to deal with that.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the government says it's about making city streets safer for workers and residents. Here's Justice Minister Paul Goldsmith.
We'll be amending the Summary Offences Act to provide police with the power to issue move-on orders for people who display disorderly, disruptive, threatening or intimidation behaviour, obstructing or impeding somebody entering a business, breaching the peace, all forms of begging, rough sleeping, and behaviour indicating an intent to inhabit a public place.
But where's the evidence it will work?
All we're doing is literally shifting people down the road, and particularly their needs down the road as well.
It's something the business community has welcomed, but people on the streets and those who work with them say the social supports the government is pointing to just aren't there.
These are the people who are regularly turning up in our courtrooms and are regularly coming to the attention of police. The simple fact is there are no options for places to take them. So it's all very well to say, police can go and issue a move-on order, and if someone fails to comply, well, they can then they can take them to a social service. I'd like to know which one the political commentators have in mind.
That's Carmel Claridge from the New Beginnings Court, and I'll get back to her and the court's work a bit later. Plus, I'm talking to a legal expert on how effective this move will be, and a political journalist who's across the decision-making process on this. RNZ's Giles Dexter was in Auckland for the announcement. He says it's been in the pipeline for a while.
So around about November, these reports started coming up that the government was considering move-on orders for people in Auckland city centre specifically at the time, because you've got things like the new convention centre. The government's been investing a lot of money in major events. Cruise ships are finally coming back in. And so there has been those concerns around antisocial behaviour in Auckland, and the government had been sort of hearing it from business communities that despite some of the interventions already in place, that this was still a problem. So they talked about it. They said they were considering it. In November, the Prime Minister said, yeah, we're looking at it, but we just need to look at where we move them, because there's no sense just shifting them somewhere else. So we need to make sure that those supports are in place. Then that sort of died down a bit. And then over the summer, we've just sort of been asking the Justice Minister and the Prime Minister, frequently, like, where's that at? Have you decided? Has Cabinet made a decision? And then, found out that on Sunday they would be confirming it, making an announcement on it. It was largely in line with what we thought they were going to announce. The only difference is that it's not just going to be Auckland anymore. It's town and city centres across the country. It's going to be everywhere.
And has there been much evidence that other parts of the country are being besieged with this sort of behaviour?
When we asked Paul Goldsmith about it, like, why did you decide to move it just from Auckland to everywhere, he mentioned that Ministerial Advisory Group on Retail Crime, the one that was led by Sunny Kashal, the one that's about to be shut down in a couple of months, that Sunny had been going up and down the country and had heard that it was a problem everywhere. Now, that was the extent of it.
I want to thank Sunny Kashal and the Ministerial Advisory Group on Retail Crime who pushed for this, and Sunny's been up and down the country and has had very strong feedback.
That's very scientific.
Well, I guess they're confident that the police can scale up these powers. We've had the gang patch legislation in place for a while now. It would essentially be the same levels of police discretion that they currently use with the gang patch legislation, the ban on gang patches in public places. You've also got those dispersal notices that police can issue to gang gatherings as well. So it would just be sort of another... They use this phrase constantly during the press conference.
Providing additional tools to police.
To give the police an extra tool.
We're just giving police another tool.
Another tool in the toolkit.
Interesting that you said that, initially the government said, well, there's no point in having a move on order unless there's somewhere to move them to. Has that changed? Because it seems to be the big complaint.
And it was the big question. And this is still something that I think will probably still need to be sorted out. It is going to go through a full legislative process. So there will be select committees, so chances for people to submit on this, because Paul Goldsmith basically said, well, it's up to the individual police officer to decide. They can move them to a reasonable distance, and it's up to the individual constable to decide what a reasonable distance is. So whatever that looks like still needs to be worked out, because there is that concern from some of those city fringe business associations that this could just shift the problem somewhere else. But they have sort of said that they want to take a reasonably holistic approach to this. So the police officer, in explaining that this move on order has been issued and that a breach will result in a fine or imprisonment, will be making assessments on what other support this person might need. So whether there is a sort of a triaging for a mental health response or a housing response or a health response. So that will be up to the individual officer to make that snap judgment at the time. I suppose in a lot of city centres, the sort of frequent rough sleepers or people causing disturbances will be known to police. Police officers might have relationships with these people, might know what these people need, but that's all still to be worked out.
So they won't be just turfing them into the back of the police car, dropping them off at Swanson and leaving them find the trail of breadcrumbs back to the city.
Well, that's what opponents of this will say will happen, that you will just shift people up to K Road or to Ponsonby or to Newmarket. Mm. But the ministers, when they made the announcement, they just basically couldn't say at this stage what any of this might mean. It's all still to be worked out in the legislative process.
Let's bring in Carmel Claridge here. She's the coordinator of a special court in central Auckland.
The Court of New Beginnings is a therapeutic court which works with recidivist offenders who are regularly appearing in the Auckland District Court on relatively low-level charges, often involving public nuisance types of offences, things like shoplifting, willful trespass, so often offences that are directly related to their state of homelessness. And on entering a guilty plea, they're offered a pathway through the Te Kōrero Timatanga Ho program, whereby their sentence is deferred until such time as they complete the program, which takes approximately 6 to 9 months, just depending on the individual. And the idea is that through monthly court appearances and connection with social supports and the structure that we can provide, we connect them with the types of services and the support that they need to ensure that they do not reoffend.
So could the use of a move-on law by police funnel these people through to your service?
Well, I don't really see how it would add anything extra of value to what we do. What it potentially could result in is increasing numbers of arrests, whereby these people end up in custody and thereby come to the attention of the court. But usually they are coming to the court because they're already on charges. So they are referred by the judges themselves, by corrections, probation, and by the counsel who are appearing on their behalf.
So what is your view of plans to introduce a move-on law? Will it work?
Well, it'll work in terms of very short-term optics into clearing a specific area, but it's simply displacing the issues and the problems onto another business's doorstep, into another community. So it's not a solution to what the fundamental problem is. And the dangers of the move-on orders far outweigh any benefit that it's going to provide, in my view.
So what are the dangers?
Well, my experience of people who are sleeping rough is that they've already got an extremely low trust in authority. It takes extraordinary time and patience to rebuild the trust that is required so that those people are willing to engage with authority, with the system, including social services. So many of them are already well known, the social agencies, but they have become marginalised and disconnected to the extent that they're refusing to have anything to do with anybody who represents authority. So a lot of the mahi that we do is try and encourage them to see themselves as a part of society rather than apart from. So move-on orders are simply reinforcing the message that we don't want you here, you are of no value, you don't belong here, you're not part of us. To me, that's a very counterproductive thing to be doing, and it's actually undermining the role that many of our frontline workers are performing. It's really undoing the work that's being done.
I guess for business owners, the message, we don't want you here, is the message that they are trying to send. Is there a balance between people not having to step over bodies on their way to work or being, threatened or assaulted, when they're out on their lunch break and helping these people out?
Let's be clear, nobody's saying that these behaviours should be condoned. Nobody's saying that these behaviours are acceptable. But what I'm trying to say is that move-on orders will simply make it someone else's problem. So you're not providing a solution. You're simply moving the problem onto someone else.
Giles Dexter says the government insists that it has been providing solutions.
They've mentioned that there has been more investment in sort of housing first solutions. So they opened up 300 more places specifically for homeless people, and they've not all been taken up. But, some of those sort of like development organisations that you speak to and city missions will say they just need more resources. Yeah. They cannot at the moment cope with the way that things are. So probably need to speak to a few of them to find out what would work for them. For the police minister and the Auckland minister have said that they have convened groups, to sit down and see what they need. But from the sounds of it, speaking to some of them, that they've explained the problem, they've explained what they need, and it's still not being met.
Yeah, and I was listening to Christopher Luxon on Morning Report list the huge amounts of money that has been put into this. Well,
we spend $550 million a year with different social service organisations supporting homeless folk. We spend $5 billion a year on housing support. We've expanded, as you know, we've done an incredible job on housing. We've made housing more affordable for purchase, rents are down.
Well, homelessness has increased under your government, so you can't have done that great a job.
So, Ingrid, just to hear me out, we've taken 6,000 people off the social housing wait list that we had when we came to power. That is excellent. That's people in proper homes. We've taken people out of emergency housing situations. And we've actually expanded the number of housing first programs places from up to another 300. We've put 10 million in for rough sleepers immediately. We've given MSD more discretion. So, there is a lot going on.
But at the same time as all this money is supposedly going into there, literally The number of homeless in Auckland has doubled, 100% up. And working in the city, you can see that. So how do those numbers tally?
It's, I guess, you need to look at some of the early intervention stuff and whether enough money is going into that. It's rather than funding everything, the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's looking at where to make those interventions first. I mean, Mark Mitchell, the police minister, was sort of very keen to stress during the press conference that these people, not all of these people are, quote, homeless, that they do have places to go, that some of them, that some of those rough sleepers in Auckland have been offered support and chosen not to take it. And so this is just kind of that final thing that the government can use to say, if anything, it's kind of pushing them into somewhere. Where they go still needs to be worked out.
I think most people would say, what is the point in putting a $2,000 fine in place for people who clearly have nothing, including a roof over their heads? Where was the logic for that?
They haven't explained that. And I mean, the other thing is the prison thing. Well, if someone goes with a maximum term of 3 months in prison, well, that's the cost of the taxpayer, for a start, the incarceration costs. But they haven't really exactly at this point explained how they arrived at the prison term and the $2,000. It could be that that's the existing penalties under the Summary Offences Act as it stands. But yeah, no rough sleeper is going to have $2,000 on them and say, sorry, officer, I'll just quickly run to an ATM. There's a lot of sticks in this, but where's the carrots?
So how do other countries deal with this problem? Some, including Olympic host cities, sweep the streets of vagrants ahead of their showcase events. The homeless get free bus tickets to somewhere else.
It's like, close the door, get out of here, we bought you a bus ticket, you can't come back. They tell you anything because they want you out of here.
Professor Mark Hennigan is a family law expert at Auckland University and has looked at move-on orders around the world. I asked him how effective they are.
Well, not very effective. Having looked at what happened in England and Wales, same in Australia and the same in USA, what it tends to do is criminalise behaviour which is not really criminal behaviour. I mean, it's homeless behaviour. It's a social welfare issue. What happened in England, it led to some very arbitrary use of the law. Freedom of movement's a fundamental civil liberty, a fundamental right, and yet these people's having it taken away from them. Arbitrary detention for something that's pretty harmless is also a fundamental human right. And in England and Wales, what they found was when the social pressure came on to do a lot of this, there were a lot of breaches of people's basic civil liberties and basic rights. And the real problem is because it's homeless people, they don't really have the means to challenge it in court. And so often they just get moved on and no one really brings a challenge on their behalf. I think some lawyers should do it on a pro bono basis because that's why we have the law. We have a society which we want people to be free in, and that's one of the big problems. In Australia, the criminalisation meant that poor old homeless people were seen as social outcasts and put to prison, which was really bad. And in America, I think one of the biggest issues they found was that moving on all the time had a real effect on their health because, like all of us, you need some stability. And if a homeless person's found a spot that they feel is comfortable, it's their spot, just like our house is our spot. And under the basic human rights things, all societies are required, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed after the war, to give people an adequate standard of living that won't affect their health. And it clearly had massive effects on people's health. They were moved out and moved around a lot, and the stress on them, their health is one of the worst in the community, and moving them on and in that way makes their health even worse. So in terms of the outcomes for homeless people, it's been really awful.
What countries have done this well?
They do it well if they see the issue as one of a social welfare issue, as a social issue rather than a criminal issue. And in many ways, our courts have been helping in this because we have some really good judges who have looked at this as a homeless issue rather than a criminal issue.
It's been proven internationally that move-on orders do, in the very short term, work in the sense that the issues are no longer visible. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, that the issues have been addressed. It just means that they are elsewhere. So the behaviours that are of concern in the Auckland CBD area won't be got rid of simply by moving them elsewhere.
Is there a country doing this right that you have looked at?
Well, Finland is the gold standard in terms of actually looking at the very complex root causes and the drivers behind the sort of offending behaviour that happens, and they're actually providing bespoke solutions. So they're providing the sort of a supportive accommodation for people with extremely complex needs and issues. So at the moment, we've got a real dearth of places for people who have that complex intersection of poor mental health plus alcohol and or drug addiction, and that there are simply not the beds available for them to go to. They may well be shunted into emergency housing, but that is not going to last particularly long. And invariably the cohort of long-term rough sleepers, the people that I see in my work, have been cycling through that system of emergency housing to lodges, to custody, to rough sleeping, and back again, and on it goes.
Viv Beck from Heart of the City, she talked about 2026 being Auckland's year, and the government's talked about that too. You've got the CRL coming on stream, brand new convention centre, cruise ships coming in, all that money for major events. We've got State of Origin next year. All these things that are happening to Auckland, and first impressions count. Press conference was done at Queen's Arcade. They're refurbishing that. They're doing that up. It's the bottom of Queen Street. You get off a cruise ship, it's one of the first places you see.
This is Ian Wright, who's the property manager at Queen's Arcade.
I don't see it as displacement of the problem. That's not a solution. It's very much about holding people to account, drawing the line in the sand and saying, we've actually got a right to be here too, the people, our visitors, and we want it to be safe and secure. And I don't think that's too much to ask.
You do want to sort of not see anyone. There are obviously, like, you talk about some other cities around the world and whether the homelessness situation here is any worse. You look at somewhere like Paris, there doesn't seem to be all that many homeless people there anymore because of the Olympics. But where did they go?
Yeah, where's the problem being moved to? Yeah.
Where's the problem being shifted to? And where will the government is saying, well, here's where the problem will be shifted in terms of these support services. But time will tell is such a horrible thing to say and a useless thing to say in journalism. But genuinely, like, we're not going to know what happens to these people until this legislation comes through.
Homeless people are the minority, thank God, and we should be ashamed to have them in this country. We should be walking the streets and saying we must make an effort to intervene early with regard to homeless people and not have homeless people in this country. We have the resources. We shouldn't have homeless people. That should be the way of looking at it. But when it's done in this way through a criminal vehicle, it tends to demonise them, and then they become the problem and they're the bad people and they deserve everything they get. And I don't think that's a very compassionate, very empathetic. I think, we should look after the most vulnerable. That's a sign of a really good society. And I think we are a really good society. And in a way, using the law in this way makes our society decline. I mean, these people should be free to move around like anyone else. That they've already got a very difficult life, and then we make their freedom of movement. Now, I understand shop owners being upset, but if we treat it as a social issue and look at ways and means to prevent it, and passing a law doesn't really solve any problems. I mean, law is a punitive thing mainly, and that doesn't solve the problem. It just doesn't. It doesn't make people less homeless. It just makes them more vulnerable, actually.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Giles Dexter, Carmel Claridge and Mark Hennigan. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.